Secret documents, declassified facts about World War II. For 50 years, free governments sat on secrets you paid taxes to fund. A file proving Soviet spies were inside the atomic bomb project. A memo where a U.S. general called radiation deaths propaganda. A record showing a Gestapo torturer worked for American intelligence, and Washington helped him escape justice. Every one of these documents is real. Every one was sealed for decades. Today, we open them. Welcome back to Dark Side of History. Every war leaves two records, the one the public was told, and the one locked in a filing cabinet with a classification stamp. Over the next 20 minutes, we're opening 4 of those cabinets. Everything you're about to hear is drawn from official sources, the U.S. National Archives, the CIA's own FOIA reading room, and declassification reports from the National Security Agency. No speculation, no reenactment dressed up as fact. Just what the paperwork actually says. Let's start with why these files stayed closed for so long in the first place. In 1998, the U.S. Congress passed the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. It ordered every intelligence agency, the CIA, the Army, the FBI, to open its wartime files on Nazi war criminals and their post-war use as informants. The result was the largest single-subject declassification effort in American history, more than 8.5 million pages, opened over the following decade. That's not the only release. The National Declassification Center still publishes new lists every quarter, as recently as this year, of military and intelligence files finally cleared for public access, some sitting classified since the 1940s. And separately, in 1995, the National Security Agency declassified an entirely different program, a code-breaking operation called Venona, kept secret for 50 years, even from 2 U.S. presidents. We'll get to what it revealed in a moment. The pattern isn't limited to Nazi-related files. In 2016, the NSA transferred more than 29,000 pages on a wartime program called TICM, a project that investigated exactly how far German code breakers had gotten into Allied and Soviet communications. And the releases keep coming. In the final quarter of 2024 alone, the National Declassification Center cleared over 500,000 pages across 27 separate projects. As recently as this spring, another batch of 58 newly declassified entries went public. Some of what's in those files dates back to the earliest days of the war. So why the decades of silence? The official reasoning usually falls into 3 categories. First, protecting intelligence, sources and methods, revealing how a code was broken can tip off future adversaries. Second, shielding the reputations of agencies and the officials who ran them. And third, plain Cold War politics, admitting certain operations would have embarrassed allies or handed propaganda material to rivals. Keep those 3 reasons in mind. You'll see all of them at work in the next 20 minutes. Quick question before we go further: which government do you think has the most World War II secrets still sealed? Drop your guess in the comments, we'll come back to it. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Within days, reports began reaching American officials that survivors were dying from something no conventional bomb could cause: radiation sickness. According to documents published by the National Security Archive, Manhattan Project Director General Leslie Groves dismissed the early accounts coming out of Japan as propaganda. Documents released as recently as September 2025 go further. They show U.S. and British officials assessing the blast and radiation effects in real time, and include a line attributed to Groves describing radiation sickness as, in his words, a pleasant way to die. The same archive published the first full American report on Hiroshima, dated just days after the bombing, which gave a conservative estimate of around 100,000 people killed. That first American damage report from Tinian Island is worth sitting with. Written just days after the bombing, it estimated roughly 100,000 deaths, and the archive that published it notes the number was explicitly called conservative at the time. Later historical estimates, incorporating deaths from radiation sickness in the months and years afterward, run significantly higher. The gap between the first official number and the fuller picture that emerged later is, in miniature, exactly what this whole video is about. None of this changes why the bombs were dropped, or the debate historians still have about ending the war. But it does show something specific. Officials closest to the Manhattan Project understood the human cost of radiation almost immediately, and chose, at least for a time, to downplay it publicly. That's not a theory. That's what's written in their own memos, now sitting in a public archive. Stop for a second. This wasn't leaked by a whistleblower. This was released, decades later, by the same government that classified it. Keep that in mind for what's coming next. On July 11, 1995, the NSA declassified something almost nobody outside a tiny circle of code breakers knew existed, Project Venona. Starting in 1943, American cryptanalysts intercepted and, slowly, painstakingly, began decoding Soviet cable traffic. The project was so secret that Presidents Roosevelt and Truman were reportedly never fully briefed on it. What the decrypts showed was staggering. Soviet intelligence had agents inside the Manhattan Project itself, the U.S. effort to build the atomic bomb, as well as sources inside the State Department, the Treasury, and even the White House. Roughly 3,000 messages were eventually decoded, implicating more than 300 Americans in some form of covert relationship with Soviet intelligence, according to the researchers who studied the release. Once the Venona decrypts were matched against other evidence, names followed. Klaus Fuchs, a physicist who had worked on the bomb itself, was confirmed as a source. So was Julius Rosenberg, and the decrypts became part of the evidence tied to his and Ethel Rosenberg's case. Even Harry Dexter White, at the time the second highest official in the U.S. Treasury Department, appears in the decoded traffic. These weren't rumors chased by tabloids. They were confirmed, decades later, by the government's own broken code. This is where things get genuinely strange. America and the Soviet Union were allies during the war years Venona covers. The espionage that later fueled Cold War paranoia, and the McCarthy-era hearings, was already happening while the two countries were fighting the same enemy. And the public wouldn't learn any of it until half a century later, when a government commission decided the secret had outlived its purpose. So a code-breaking program ran for decades after the war ended, and stayed classified until 1995. What else, right now, is still sitting in a locked file somewhere with your government stamp on it? Now to the file that, more than any other, explains the anger behind these releases. Klaus Barbie was the Gestapo chief in Lyon, France, known as the Butcher of Lyon, for personally torturing prisoners, including members of the French resistance. He was sentenced to death in absentia by a French court for war crimes. Declassified U.S. Army records, released under that same 1998 Disclosure Act, confirm what investigators suspected for decades. In 1947, the Army's Counterintelligence Corps recruited Barbie as an informant, valuing his knowledge of French communist networks. When France demanded his extradition, the CIC refused, and internal files show officials were also worried that surrendering him would embarrass the US by exposing the recruitment itself. In 1951, US intelligence helped Barbie leave Europe entirely, funneling him to Bolivia along a network historians call the Ratlan. He lived there for over 3 decades, at one point advising a military dictatorship on interrogation and torture tactics. It wasn't until 1983, after Barbie was finally expelled to France, that the truth became undeniable. The US government issued a formal apology to France for helping a convicted war criminal escape justice. Barbie's CIA file itself wasn't fully released until 2007, partially opened in 2000, then held back for another 7 years. Barbie wasn't reviewed in isolation either. Under the same 1998 law, investigators prioritized name files on the most notorious figures first: Adolf Hitler, Adolf Eichmann, Joseph Mengele, and more than a dozen others who had contact with Western intelligence after the war. Case after case, what those files revealed was a pattern: intelligence agencies weighing a former Nazi's usefulness against the public's right to know, and, for years, choosing usefulness. This isn't an isolated case either. Other declassified files show similar arrangements with different former Nazi officials. We'll cover more of those in a future video. For now, here's the question worth sitting with: how many decisions like this one are still classified today? 4 files. Roughly 50 years of silence, on average, before any of them saw daylight. A spy program hidden from 2 presidents. A general's private words about radiation deaths. A war criminal on the payroll of the people who were supposed to bring him to justice. None of this is speculation, it's what the documents themselves say, now that they're finally public. If you want to know what governments are still sitting on right now, that's a video for another day. Subscribe if you want to be here when we open it. And tell me in the comments, out of these 4, which one made you angriest?